Hello. So today we are going to continue our experimentations with new stuff and new things to make video about, and I am going to show you my eye making progress. I say progress because everything is always changing because I can always find new ways to make stuff. And right now though, I'm pretty happy with this technique for making eyes. I've gotten some really cool eyes out of it, and I thought maybe it would be helpful to share to you so that you can see. These are the more realistic BJD style eyes, not the anime ones. I will continue to work on the anime eyes until I get something that I think I just need to practice, honestly. But anyway, to start, we have safety. I will be using resin, and you need nitrile gloves to work with resin. It's very important. Don't use latex, the chemicals react. You also need a face mask that is graded for vapor because there is chemical vapors involved. You need a room that is well ventilated, and don't let your pets in the room with you while you're doing it, that kind of good stuff. Yeah, please be safe. I also use a apron because I'm very messy, and you really don't want this stuff on your skin. So now I'm bringing out some of my tools and attempting to show you the resin I'll be using today. It is Amazing Cast Clear resin. This is pretty easy to find in the States. It's not my, excuse you, it's not my favorite resin, but it does the trick with eye bases. So I'm using up the stuff that I had. You can see my little cup is a little measuring cup. It does have the measurements on the side, and since we are doing a resin that requires 1-to-1 volume for mixing, that will come in handy. I also have a little pipette that I use in this case to stir, though it's not great to stir with, and also to more precisely put the resin where I want it to go. Now I'm attempting to show you. I'm still getting used to this camera, can you tell? Anyway, you can sort of, oh goodness. There you go. You can see the little measurements. I'm gonna go up to drams, 2 drams, okay, sure, and 4 drams. I start, oh yeah, we're not even going to start mixing resin yet. Before you start mixing resin, I recommend, oh, and here we have the dye that I'll be using. It is Cast & Crafts Opaque Pigment. It is designed for epoxy resin. There's reasons for that. Don't use it with UV resin. I mean, you kind of can get away with it, but I don't. Anyway, that's a mold that I made. It's very bad. You can tell it's rough around the edges and pretty messy. These are molds that I purchased. They're much nicer. I can't think of a single company that offers them that I feel comfortable recommending, but they are available if you look for them. I'm getting everything all set up before I start mixing my resin and just kind of deciding which sizes I want. One thing is I never know quite exactly how much resin I'm going to have, so I usually get extras so that if I do have extra resin made up, I'll have somewhere to put it before it cures, because as soon as you mix the resin together, you will start the timer, and you've got a certain amount of working time depending on the resin and the temperature, and you just need to go. So right now I am using those little measurements on the side of the cups to measure out the 2 parts of both hardener and resin. I started with the hardener first because I just find that easier to mix in later. And then I remembered I had an experiment I wanted to do. The experiment is this Perlex mica? Is it mica? I think it's mica. Perlex powders that, this one's the macro pearl, and I'm going to use a little soft brush to brush it onto one of my molds just out of curiosity. I wanted to see what would happen. So before I mix my resin, I do that real quick. And it's very pretty. There we go, we got it focused. So now I will start mixing my resin. This I do very slowly, or as slowly as I can. Using the pipette to mix is not actually the greatest because you don't want to get air in your resin, especially right now. It's the middle of winter here, and the colder the resin is, the thicker it is, and the easier it holds on to all those air bubbles. You can see as I'm stirring, the pipette is adding air bubbles, and just the act of stirring adds air bubbles. Air bubbles aren't great, so we do try to minimize them. I am watching the resin right now because you can kind of see, even though both parts are clear, one part, like while you mix it, there's these sort of smeary lines that you're creating, and you want to stir until everything is crystal clear, or as crystal clear as you can get with a bunch of air bubbles in it. You also want to make sure that you're scraping all your edges and that you're not leaving any parts of the cup undisturbed. You need everything mixed together because that is important to maintain your ratio of resin, which is important to getting a hard cure. So I stir and stir and stir. I am leaving all of this real time, so you can see that it does take a while. I'm getting impatient and I'm stirring faster and I'm adding more bubbles in. Now I'm trying to see if it's clear in that it's completely stirred, or if the air bubbles are getting in the way of being able to tell. I do think it's relatively done now. I'm looking at it very closely. There we go. Okay, so I do sort of smack the cup on the table a little bit to try and encourage those air bubbles to come up. And I also get out this is like an embossing heater. It's basically like a heat gun, but maybe not as powerful. I'm using it to not only warm the top of the resin to pop those bubbles, but I also try to warm up the rest of the resin. You gotta be careful doing this though, because these little flimsy cups will melt, and that would be a disaster, so don't heat your cup up too much. But yeah, taking advantage of the fact that the warmer resin is a little bit less viscous. And now I really recommend not messing with it for like 5 to 10 minutes. That's really hard to do, and I certainly failed at it, but the longer you can wait in that 5 to 10 minute range, you don't want to wait too long because then your resin will start to cure. But the longer you can wait and let those bubbles come up to the surface, the better. I pop the surface bubbles again. And even though there's still a million bubbles in there, I think I decide to move on with the next step. Probably could have waited longer here, but you know. I am going to add the Opaque white resin dye. This is good stuff. I recommend this over acrylics because the acrylics will add too much liquid like water into your resin, and that's actually super bad. It will keep your resin from curing. This stuff is much more concentrated. So I added 5 drops to get a nice opaque white, and I started stirring it in. Again, you still don't want to incorporate bubbles. I could have probably done this right after and then let it sit. Actually, yeah, that probably would have been a better idea. So put your color in, then let it sit for the bubbles to raise to the surface. But you know, I don't do everything perfect all the time. You shouldn't expect yourself to either. And again, you want to make sure that everything is incorporated evenly so that your color will look even. Smash it on the table a few times to encourage those bubbles to pop up. I don't know why I twist it when I do this. Things you never question until you're watching a video of yourself doing it. Alright, then we pop those bubbles, and we're considering this good enough. So now I am going to put this into the eye molds. And I do use a pipette this time. You can also like spoon little drops in with a tiny spoon. There's lots of ways, but I recommend, or I like the pipette because I can add just the tiniest amount at a time. It doesn't usually add a giant bubble like it did that time, but you know, sometimes it does. And you'll note I'm not filling this all the way. And of course I have to make a big mess because we're on camera, but I'm not filling each eye mold all the way up. I am letting the resin ooze its way around the outside iris because that place gets air bubbles a lot. And now you'll see we've skipped to a new video and a new placement. Why? Because my battery died on those last eyes. And I was really annoyed, so once your resin is mixed up and stirred, you can't really stop. And I even tried to swap out with a separate battery, but the separate battery just wouldn't work at all in my, like it had just stopped working. So I literally had to buy batteries and everything after this. It was great. But anyway, so now we're back to stirring the resin. We're gonna zip through this and get back to the pipette stage, or the dropping little amounts of resin in stage. Alright, so we're back to adding just a little drop or two into each mold. As I was explaining before, the reason I do this is because the edge of the iris, that ridge, is the worst at catching air bubbles, and it's really hard to get them not to form there. So I've started doing this where I just put a few drops in, and as I'm going, you can see the first ones are kind of, the resin is oozing its way around. Oh, and then I also have this adorable, just absolutely cute design mold by Cindy J. Jang, another YouTuber here actually, who makes the cutest freaking molds. This is a little poison bottle. So I'm going ahead and putting the back on there just to use up the rest of the white resin. And of course that cute little skull. But even with these molds, I'll put a few drops in and then move on to something else to try and encourage the resin to not form bubbles along the edges of everything, because it's very prone to doing that, especially when it's winter and the resin is a little thicker. This is an especially thick resin and it's not ideal. I think I do prefer a little bit thinner resins, but does the trick, and if you're careful, you can avoid getting bubbles where you don't want them. But now that the eyes have been sitting for a little bit, I am going to go in with this little daughter tool. I like it because the end is rounded, so I'm less likely to damage the mold. But I'm running that along the little ridge on the, along the iris. And I'm just trying to knock any air bubbles that may have formed out of the way. This works pretty good. It doesn't always work. Sometimes you still get air bubbles, so keep that in mind. If you're making pairs like this for eyes and you make one that doesn't work, I recommend just tossing it, and I don't know how to fix that air bubble. And I actually did get one with this batch, so I'll show you what they look like. But yeah, I tossed the one that didn't work, and I make enough eyes that inevitably I'm going to have another failed pair, and then I'll have two. So you can see I continue to fill them in quite slowly. This just ensures that I'm not overfilling my molds, because that is really easy to do when you pour straight from the cup. I didn't grab a pipette because I'm pretty sure I just didn't feel like opening the box that has the pipettes in it. So instead I'm spooning it with the back of my plastic spoon, which is what I'm using to stir things with. If possible, when I fill the backs of the eyes, I do like to give it a little bit of a dome, like not dome, but like I fill it just a tiny bit so that it's more plump looking when the light hits it than going inwards, because the resin does shrink a little bit as it cures, and I just prefer that. So that's what you see me doing here, is just adding a tiny bit of resin at a time, trying not to get it to overflow, but also trying to get it a little more filled out. And as much as I love these little star shapes, I struggle with them. I almost always get bubbles in the tips because I forget to go in with something to pry them out. So I'm kind of putting the resin near the edge and smooshing it in, hoping that I won't get bubbles in the tips. And then I sort of scrape the resin off, and it's not ideal, but it works, sort of. And then I realized I still had a whole bunch of resin, so I start filling in some of the backup eyes. Now you can see why I wear gloves, because I'm a hot mess. I'm very clumsy. Um, I have, this is a little silicone, I think they're actually used for sculpting, but they're great for resin, and I'm using that to sort of scrape off some of that excess resin that I didn't want. I had some mad hope that I would be able to fill that eye. No, absolutely not. There's not nearly enough resin for that. But I did use it to kind of clean up and refill those little bones and, just futz with it. When I'm finally done futzing, I do put these under, um, just under something. I actually did cut out the backside of a cereal box, and that's what I use to sort of set on top of it, and that is to keep floating cat hair and dust from settling into the resin as it cures, because once it does that, it stays there forever. Before I do that though, I'm going over the top one more time with heat to pop all of the remaining bubbles that might have floated to the surface. I'm using a long neck lighter this time because the heat gun sort of displaces the resin, and when you filled it up like I have, that can make a mess, so I didn't use that. I've effectively given up on that one eye. It's just not gonna be filled, which is a bummer, but sometimes you just don't have the exact right amount of resin, and that's just the way it is. But yeah, this is all gonna go under my cereal box. I'm gonna let it cure. I recommend with eye bases to let them cure a little bit longer maybe than even the estimate, which I know it's terrible. You want to unmold things as soon as it's even a little solid, but eyes will get deformed and that will really mess you up in future. So wait until they're nice and hard before taking them out of the molds. And there's my cereal box, just to show you kind of how I do it. I apologize, the table I'm working on is actually glass, so you can see everything through it, so it kind of makes what you're seeing a little confusing, but it's just a cereal box. And now, with the movie magic, we've skipped ahead to everything is now nice and solid. I was real excited to demold this super adorable little, isn't that so cute? It's a shaker, so you can fill that up with whatever you want, and it's gonna be real fun to figure out. And that tiny little skull, I'm not over it. I love her design so much. But yeah, it's so cute. Then we're gonna pull out the little tiny bones. And the little sparkles. Which, yep, sure enough, that one ended up with a bubble in it, so I think I end up tossing it. Luckily it's not huge, so it's not a lot of wasted resin. The other ones actually turned out alright, so that's cool. Then I'm gonna demold the earrings. These earrings are really cool. They're also by Cindy, and they've got this, like, I could not get the camera to catch it, but they've got this sort of hollow effect on them that comes straight from the mold itself, so that's very neat. We're setting those aside though, because that's not the point of this video. We pull out that sad half eye and just give that a toss. And check out, I'm inspecting each eye pretty closely to make sure that they don't have any bubbles. It's really not worth keeping them if they do. This one's looking quite good though, so I do set that aside. And that one. And the very last one has a bubble, which is annoying, but also not the worst because it means I can finally show you what they look like. So you can see it right there. And getting my camera to focus on it was quite the trick. But yeah, when it's like that, there's no easy way or practical way to save it. So I just toss them, honestly. It's a bummer, but it's not like a ton of wasted resin at least. So now we are moving on to coloring the eyes. I like to use either mica powder or these like Chameleon powders that Let's Resin came out with. I'm kind of just experimenting with color as usual, so I grabbed the magenta one, and I really wanted to see what would happen if I mixed my Pearl X powder in with it. If you're wondering why my little silicone containers are upside down, it's because they actually are worn out. So the inside of them has become so textured that the resin sticks to it and yoinks, like it breaks it basically more and more every time. So I've started using the bottoms of them to mix my small amounts of resin. I am using UV resin now. This is different than the two-part resin. This cures with UV light. And you'll actually see here, I do have a little bit of trouble. I was filming during the day and I am near a window and my resin started to cure on me. So I had to flip my little Count Chocula cereal box up and actually block some of that sunlight. You'll see that happen a bit off camera, but I'm mixing my Chameleon magenta resin and the Pearl X powder macro pearl, and it's making this crazy orange color that I wasn't super expecting. So I decided to add a little bit more magenta, and it didn't do a lot, it just made it more orange. So I think the chameleon colors for this magenta is magenta to orange, and something about mixing in the Pearl X powder seems to have just sort of landed it in mostly orange, which is really strange. But you know, whatever. Experiments are experiments, so I mixed it in though, got a slightly darker color, which I liked enough to go forward with. And now I use this soft silicone pointer thing to just kind of smear the resin inside the eyeball, the iris part. I am so sorry this ended up off camera. I try my best, and I was really struggling because there was a hair in the UV resin, so I had to get that out without getting UV resin everywhere, but now we're back kind of on camera good. So when you blorp the resin in there, it does tend to just fall straight to the bottom. So I will often put enough resin in there to sort of coat everything and then just kind of pull it towards the edges as best I can. And then I will flash cure it with a UV torch. And a flash cure doesn't do a full cure. It's very important to keep in mind, but it will kind of hold everything in place a little bit longer than it would otherwise. So I'm using my little UV torch here to just kind of take about 10 seconds to flash cure that, keep it from slumping down the sides as I work on the next eye. Again, off camera, I'm sorry, this is very fiddly work and I was trying very hard to see. I actually don't have the best eyesight, so it is a little tough to work around the camera sometimes. But I'm doing the same thing I did with the other one, and I'm realizing at the same time that my resin is already curing. That's how fast it cures under the sun. It's kind of wild. So I was just trying to work fast at this point. And that one looked good enough, so I flash cured it as well. And this is me attempting to put that box up so that I can maybe salvage my unused resin. But nope, you can see it sort of cures on the top first, and so now it's all gloopy. You don't want it to be gloopy like that. So I gave up on it. I flash cured it, and then I just decided to cure it fully under the lamp. Okay, so the next one I decided to use more of the Chameleon powder, and this one is the Let's Resin Chameleon powder in Plum, and it kind of did the same thing when I mixed it with the macro pearls. It seemed like it sort of became less plum and more the shift color. So I thought that was really interesting. I don't know if I'm going to continue mixing in the macro pearls. I'm not 100% sure I like what it does with the colors, but for now I just do exactly the same thing I did before. I put whatever color powders I want down, I wiped off my little silicone stick, and I mixed them all together with a tiny blob of UV resin. And you don't want to make too much at this point because you're actually only covering a very small, very small area. This is me trying to decide if this color is even worth using. It ended up kind of brownish, weirdly. I don't know. I decided to go for it just to see. I'm trying so hard to remember to keep it on camera, and I just keep forgetting. But it's the same as before. I blob in the colors, and then I just sort of give it a little bit of time to settle. If anywhere looks a little thin, I blob in more color. Giving it that little bit of time to settle, though, kind of smooths everything out, which I prefer. And we flash cure it. And same exact thing with I2. If I do more resin stuff, I'm going to try to find a better camera angle so you can see more of what I'm doing and I can see what I'm doing. Because this angle actually did mess me up a little bit at one point, which we'll see coming up here. Once I have both eye bases flash cured, I do put them under the lamp for anywhere from 1.5 to 3 minutes just to get a more solid cure going. You actually don't want to leave any uncured resin in there, and because they have the pigment powder mixed in to the UV resin, it's important to make sure it gets cured. You don't want them to leak later because there's uncured resin in them. That would just be an absolute disaster on every front. So we wait. While I was waiting, I was thinking about what color I wanted to do next. I grabbed the orchid color because I thought it was kind of similar but slightly darker than the plum, and then I grabbed the rose color because I thought it would look nice with the magenta. Sometimes I will just add to existing colors like I am here. This, I feel, sort of makes the colors match more. You can accidentally use too much a color though, and if you're not using super thin layers like I am with the eyes, that can cause you problems. So just keep that in mind when you're going for the bold colors like I am here. UV resin might not always be your best option, but because we are going to do a very thin smear of this, it will be okay, which you will see coming up here. Because next is adding the ring around the iris. And I grab my dotting tool, and this one has a smaller side and a bigger side, and I'm using a slightly bigger side, and I am literally drawing in, and I'm so sorry it's not focusing. My camera takes its sweet time, but I am literally drawing in a very thin rim around the edge with a slightly darker color than what I used to fill it. And the cool part about the doming process is that as thick and chunky as this ring looks, it's gonna look thinner once we dome it. So my goal here is, I don't want it too thick obviously, but I also want it to be even all the way around if at all possible. So I'm just working on making sure I'm getting even coverage and that I'm not exceeding outside of the inner dome of the iris. So you can kind of see how that went. It's not 100% perfect, and honestly it doesn't need to be, but again we're going to flash cure that so that it doesn't slump down into the center where we don't want it to go. And we do exactly the same thing on eye 2. I like using the dotting tools for this because they're easier to clean than a brush would be, and I do think I get a lot of really nice precision out of it that I might not be able to get with a brush. I'm actually really bad with brushes, so this method just works best for me. And this is me just deciding that this color is definitely too dark to use with the lighter colored eyes. So I'm peeling off the cured UV resin from the other one. Oh, goodness. And I will add more of the... That was me realizing that my powder was just going everywhere because of static electricity. Thanks, static. That's because I don't make a big enough mess on my own, right? Anyways, I didn't bother to use any of the macro pearls in this one. I just put the rose color in. And you don't want to use too much because then you're just wasting your powders. So I very carefully tip that on. I decided to add maybe a tiny bit of the darker color in too, just for fun. So I didn't bother to really clean off the dotter tool. But I thought the rose added a fun tint to this. Really, playing around with the colors is definitely the most fun part. And using my dotting tool again, even on this smaller eye. Oh, this is me realizing that I made a mess, and I got some powders on the whites of the eye, which does need to be taken care of before you dome your eye. But before then, I am going in and using the daughter tool in exactly the same way to add a rim around this one. Okay, so now I'm going to clean off the little bit of extra powder that I got on the whites of the eyes, or the sclera, I guess you could call it. Um, I didn't have any Q-tips, so I improvised using a little bit of paper towel wrapped around my daughter tool, and then I dipped that into some hydrogen peroxide. I want to say hydrogen peroxide. No, I'm lying. Isopropyl alcohol. What on earth was I thinking? Anyway, so this is just isopropyl alcohol, and this is good for cleaning up resin. And I'm literally just scrubbing the eye whites. And I'm so sorry this is off camera again. I was having a really hard time seeing it, but it's the kind of thing that because it's there, it would have drove me insane if I left it. So I just scrub away. It's really good at getting rid of excess powder that's where it shouldn't be. And yeah, so it also dries very quickly, which is very good because you don't want these wet while using the resin on them. I decided that I didn't care for the sort of maroony brown that the bigger eyes were. So I decided to use the slightly lighter color that had the rose pigments in it to sort of smear around on the inside to sort of alter the color a little bit. It's a little bit like using multiply because the old color is going to show through to some extent because the stuff that I'm putting on there isn't fully opaque, but it did alter the final color, and I think for the better. So this is not a step that you need to do. If you are happy with the inner color, you can absolutely just leave it. But in my case, I decided before going forward that I wanted to alter it a little bit. And it's kind of hard to see on camera, but there is a difference. Now, before the next step, I am going to hard cure these one more time. And since I am done with these UV resins, I do put those under the light as well because, as you saw, it made cleaning them up a lot easier. And you really shouldn't be throwing out uncured resin because it's bad. So I cure all of my tools and then peel the resin off of them. So I try to use tools that, well, like the metal tools, you can't really do that with. The resin will stick, so I wipe those off with a paper towel. And then I'll just leave the paper towel out and the sun will do the job for me. But the plastic or the silicone tools I'll just put under the light and cure everything and then peel it off later. So while that's curing, I am just cleaning up a little bit. So while I am waiting for the stuff to finish curing, I do start picking my eyes. Um, these are half pearl. They usually sell as nail art, but I found some that have just a ton of different sizes, and I find them really, really good for making pupils out of because when you dome the eyes, any flaw in either the pupil size, the pupil shape, anything to do with the pupil is magnified. So having these little plastic bits that are really nice and uniform makes the pupil step way less stressful, though as you will find, you can still mess it up. These eye making is just very fiddly, but I do really like these little half pearls. They're just little bits of plastic basically that are nice and round, and they work pretty good. So I grabbed a couple larger ones and a couple smaller ones. One thing I have noticed about making eyes is because the dome does magnify the pupil, you actually want your physical pupil to look a little on the small side when you insert it, and then the dome will enlarge it to look more natural. So that's always fun. But yeah, as I'm working, I'm just peeling off the used up resin from the previous steps and grabbing our eyes. Now, I am using just a tiny drop of my clear resin, and I'm dropping that in the very center of the eyes without any color at all, and this is essentially going to glue our pupil in place. So each eye gets a tiny little drop, not even a full drop. You can see I'm sort of cutting it off with my tool before it becomes too big. You don't want to use too much for this step. And then I very carefully with the tweezers place each pupil into the eyes, and it's not very easy to grip them, but yeah, that's why you don't want too much resin, because inevitably the eye drops to the side and you have to like smoosh it into the correct position. It is super important that your pupils end up in the very center. And you see, I do spend a lot of time on this, and I still manage to mess it up on one of the eyes, which is kind of a bummer. But yeah, I highly recommend taking your time, look really closely at these, look at them from every single angle. I can see the one that needs fixing and I can't fix it now. Oh, it's just heartbreaking. But the upper left one is not correctly placed, and I don't think I end up actually fixing it, despite taking the time to look at it more closely. Just fix it. Okay, so I'm bopping it around a bit. It's still wrong. Oh well. But anyway, so yes, you definitely want to take your time. And as you can see, the pupils do look a little on the small side. That is okay. Here I found some more gunk on the white of the iris, so I was trying to scrape it off. It didn't work great, but you know. Actually, which one is it? Maybe I did fix the one only to knock the other one off center. Wouldn't that be ironic? Well, either way, we're flash curing them now, so there's no going back. And it might be tempting to just fill the eye up and make the dome right away. I don't recommend doing that because it's really easy to get bubbles as the UV resin is curing, the deeper the UV resin is. So I will do my eyes with the clear in like 3 layers. So I do the layer that glues the pupil in, then I do a second layer that just kind of evens the top off, and then I do the dome layer. And I find that minimizes but doesn't completely get rid of the occasional bubble popping up where you don't want it. Eye making is very fiddly. I would call myself a beginner at this functionally. Like, I definitely don't feel like a pro, but I think this is where I noticed that the one was off and was like, well, shoot. Or maybe I was still trying to get the stuff off the edge. These pale eyes just weren't having it. I did end up having to abandon them because of that wonky pupil. Alright, so now we are adding layer 2, and the first thing I do is make a big mess. It's okay though, right? Like, we're showing you all the mistakes that can happen. Yeah. I'd say I do it on purpose, but I'm not. So I'm actually, and of course I panicked and took everything off too far down for you to see, but all I'm doing is using that little flat silicone scraper tool and scraping all the excess resin off. So it's not complicated. You just got to clean it up a little bit and move on. Um, and then, like with the eye bases, I'm just filling a little bit of a drop in and letting the resin sort of ooze its way around that pupil. And you know, I usually do the 3 layers. If you want to do 4 layers, that's probably even safer. But the deeper your UV resin gets, the more likely you're going to end up with problems. In general, I've noticed that even when it's perfectly clear and the light can go all the way through it, it can still cause issues. So at this stage, the pupils still look way too small. That's because there's no dome at all. I literally just topped everything up. I am going over them super quick with the lighter just because I saw a few bubbles lurking. But now you don't even necessarily need to flash cure this layer. You can just put it under the lamp and cure it like normal. Oh, I guess I did flash cure it anyway though. Well, you probably don't need to, honestly, but if you're like me, do it anyway. And now we dome. So this is exactly the same. We're just adding a very small drop on. While doming, you will see that the pupil is going to look a lot bigger, and that's good. That's what we wanted. You do not want your resin to exceed past the iris part, so you kind of want it to use the surface of tension to sort of naturally keep the dome in place. You also want to be real careful about bubbles. It might be tempting to like look at it from the side to make sure that the dome is exactly the same height on both of them, but I actually recommend looking at the eyes from the front and making sure that your irises look the same size. And that's kind of what I'm doing here, is I'm just double checking and making sure that my irises look like they match. And you got to be super, super careful because it's real easy to accidentally put too much resin in and then your dome overflows, and that's not good. So I am sort of pulling it out of that other one because I definitely added too much. And I'm putting it on the wonky eye, only to start realizing that the eye is in fact wonky. The pupil is off center and it becomes more and more noticeable the bigger the dome gets. Lame. So that bummed me out. I ended up doming the second eye anyway, but these eyes I kind of considered a wash. I might keep the one that turned out alright, maybe if I ever want a doll that has 2 different colored eyes. But for now, oh yep, I think this is me noticing that the one is very off and being like, fine. So I use the lighter to get rid of any bubbles. And then I flash cure. This one you do want to flash cure just because you don't want your dome to collapse when you're moving it or while it's curing in the long cure. I just prefer to flash cure real quick to be on the safe side. I end up not bothering to do the final step on the wonky eyes because I don't like that pupil is wrong. I think it's way too distracting and noticeable. The other one turned out nice though, and I'm kind of bummed about that because like that's a really fun, interesting color, that sort of orangey color. But anyway, I set them off to cure again. I think I end up curing them for like 3 minutes just to make absolutely sure that all those layers underneath are all cured fully. And wait again. So here I am showing, like, the colors are real fun. I might have to remake these just because those are some neat colors. I like the little hint of pink in there. And then these ones also turned out nice as far as the color goes. I do think I made the right choice adding that little bit of rose in there. I think it gives it just kind of a fun tone. But here you can see from the side the doming process, like that pupil didn't go that high as it looks. Like this is all just cool things the light reflecting is doing. So I'm really pleased with how the darker, bigger eyes turned out and pretty disappointed that the pupil was off on the other eyes. I set those aside and now I'm going to move on to the last step, which in my head I have nicknamed the Make It Candy step because something about adding this final top coat of gloss just makes them look like candy every time. So right now we've got a very distinct sclera and a very distinct dome, and essentially what this gloss step is going to do is meld them together and smooth out the line between the dome and the sclera. So I am using this, it is another UV resin. I got this one at Michael's, I believe, and I just like it because it has a brush with it and it does cure hard. This actually is a pretty decent resin, so I am using it to paint the eyeball, which of course is off camera again. I'm so sorry guys. I really try. Oh, yep, here I noticed. Just barely get it in frame. Alright, but what I'm doing here is you can see where the light is hitting it is now smoothed out, and that's a good thing. So after painting the resin on there, I do actually let it sit for just a couple of seconds to make sure that all those brush strokes sort of smooth themselves out while I'm spinning the eye on the stick. And that is really important to getting it to this really beautiful, smooth, glossy finish, which of course my camera doesn't want to focus on. We're forcing it now, right? No, we're gonna look at that stupid bottle. Like, oh, this camera, you guys. I'm so dumb with it. I'm trying so hard. Come on now. Oh, what if I put the eye down where the stupid bottle is? I don't know why I didn't keep doing that. Hey, there we go. So we got a nice, beautiful close-up view. You can see how the resin is just smooth over that dome. You can see it in the reflected light. And you can see how the dome does cool things to the eye. And you can see all those sparkly pigments in there. Very, very fun. I love this step. It's so satisfying. So now we do the second eye in the same way. I stick it onto the end of a paintbrush with a, did I just not, are we not bringing that, what's going on, guys? What am I doing? It's not, okay, I noticed, thank goodness. Okay, so we're just painting on the resin, get a nice thick gloopy layer, and you're gonna think, oh no, this resin's never gonna smooth out, but it does. You just keep rolling it around. Make sure everything is covered. Sometimes there'll be like a tiny little patch where it won't be covered. That's annoying. I don't know why my camera loves that bottle. Come on. Anyway, once your layer is nice and smooth, you do definitely want to flash cure this because you need all of that to stay in place before your final couple of hard cures. So once the flash curing is done, I put it under the lamp again for about 3 minutes, and then it's still usually just the slightest bit uncured. You can either keep putting it under the lamp until it's hard and it's not sticky to the touch. Don't touch it with your actual fingers, touch it with gloves. But you don't want it sticky at all. So a lot of times what I'll do is, because I tend to work at night because the sunlight gets in the way and starts curing things before I'm ready. So a lot of times I will just set it up near the window and wait a day, and then it'll be hard cured. But anyway, here are the final eyes in my beautiful doll Iris. She is a Fairyland People 65 Cheyenne. I honestly don't know how it's pronounced. But anyway, she's gorgeous, and these eyes actually suit her perfectly, which I was super thrilled by. I hope this video was helpful. It's pretty long and rambling, and I'm still getting used to the new sort of format with the my little avatar, and I don't know. How do you feel about it? Do you like this? Do you want to keep seeing videos like this? Please like and subscribe. I am still going to be doing sewing videos eventually, I promise, one of these days. Right now we're just kind of figuring stuff out, but I had a lot of fun with this. I hope you did too, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.